Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Jack Jowers, and I'll be the host for today's conversation. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues in bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. We'd like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as a part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is Remapping Utah Politics, Redistricting 2021. We are pleased to be joined by panelists Representative Paul Ray from the Utah State Legislature and co-chair of the Legislative Redistricting Committee, James Curry, and an assistant professor at the University of Utah in the Political Science Department. Rex Facer, the chair of the Utah Independent Redistricting Commission, and Senator Karen Mayne of the Utah Legislature. Today's discussion will be moderated by Mallory Bateman, a senior research analyst at the Gardner Policy Institute. And if you have questions as the discussion goes on, please enter them into the YouTube chat. And with that, I will turn the time over to Mallory.
Well, thanks for welcoming everybody, Jack, and for introducing our panelists. I'm Mallory Bateman. I'm a senior research analyst and also the State Data Center coordinator over at the Gardner Institute. And we are a partnership program, that State Data Center, with the Census Bureau. So I'll provide a couple highlights of the redistricting data if you haven't been tuning into the census news, and then we'll turn it over to the panel. So we found out with the apportionment data that came out first, that Utah stayed at 4 congressional seats, but we were also the fastest growing state in the nation at 18.4%. That was kind of moderated growth from previous decades we had experienced in Utah. And we added that 18.4% is around 507,000 Utahns. That growth was experienced in different ways throughout the state. So Northern Utah and Southwest Utah had some pretty intense growth, where other parts of the state, kind of central Utah, some of them are small or rural communities, either didn't grow very much or lost population. So we have some different growth dynamics going on in the state. Part of that is also increasing racial and ethnic diversity throughout the state. Now 1 in 4 Utahns identifies as something other than non-Hispanic white. So that's just a trend that we've seen, especially since the 1990s. We've had a lot of migration that's kind of changed who Utahns are and what we look like, what we're interested in. So with all these changing growth dynamics, we find out with the redistricting data a lot more about our local communities, and that's how we know how Northern Utah grew, how parts of the state maybe declined. We know that Southern Salt Lake County and Northern Utah County experienced some pretty rapid and intense growth, a lot of new residents in those areas. And so we get this data once a decade. This redistricting data informs the redistricting processes that we're going to talk about today, and provides us a little bit of demographic data. Little shout out for the Census Bureau. Hopefully we'll gain all of the census data next year, maybe late summer, early fall. And I'll also throw out one other fun fact with the census data. So the release of the data was delayed, which has impacted everyone's process, made it a little bit trickier to try to navigate this space this time around. It is the only time in census history that the release of the data has been delayed. So those impacts of COVID-19 on data collection, on processing, were pretty significant. So with all of that, we're going to jump into talking to our experts about redistricting, and we're going to start kind of just discussing the redistricting processes. This time around, we've got some new things going on, and so I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Facer and just ask, can you provide some background on the Independent Redistricting Commission and its processes?
Sure. In 2018, the public passed Proposition 4, which created the Independent Redistricting Commission. And then in 2020, with compromise with the Utah Legislature under Senate Bill 200, we created the committee as it currently stands with the set of criteria that we have as we draw our maps. And we will eventually present them to the legislature, and the legislature has the ultimate decision on which maps to finally approve.
And I'm just going to stick in one extra question. When do you get to present those to the legislature?
So we will present our maps on November 1st, and we're looking forward to that day.
So Representative Ray, I know we've got two different processes. Obviously, the legislature is the final say on the process. Can you share some insights into the legislative redistricting process?
You bet. So we've been out on the road also, just like Rex has with the commission, and we've been taking a lot of public input. For instance, the last week before last, we were gone basically Monday through Friday, swinging through Eastern Utah. We've kind of set up a parallel to what the commission's doing. They're going out to communities. We're going out to communities. We're trying to do separate communities so that we're covering more of Utah between the two of us. And then we're slowly working on maps based on the input that we've received from the public. Now that that's over, we'll sit down. This is an interim week for us, so we kind of have other things we have to do, but hopefully at the end of this week or first of next week, really get down to drawing some maps and taking a look at what we've learned. And then when the commission comes in November 1st, they'll present their maps to us, and then we can take under advisement what they've done too, and either accept their maps as is, maybe merge them together with ours, or just we'll look at what the maps are and then make a determination from that point. The rest of our game plan basically is we'll meet with the commission on the 1st, accept their maps, then we will have another, we'll take a week to get some things put together. We'll have another public hearing on November 8th to discuss the maps that we've kind of come up with. And then November 9th, we start the special session to actually adopt the maps.
And so maybe either one of you or Senator Mayne or Professor Curry, but the timing of this, I know that it was tightened because of the census delay, but what frames the timing? Is it so that the clerks can prepare? What kind of provides that end date?
Yeah, that's part of it, is because once we're done, the process isn't complete. We'll adopt the maps, the governor signs, and then it goes to the county clerks, and they have to redraw all the precincts. And those have to be done prior to the 1st of January, when people can start going out, signing up to do signatures and those types of things. They need to know what areas they can draw signatures from. And so that has to be done. So, we're taking us, and it's really rough. I know for the commission, this is the first time they've been in existence, and they got a shortened time period to do all their work. Rex and I were frantically on the phone during special sessions as we were getting information from the Census Bureau, trying to figure out, when the heck can we do this and still give Rex and his group a time to get their job done, and yet still give us time and still give the commission or the county's time after that. And so that's kind of where we came up. So basically what would typically be 8 months worth of work, in about 8 or 9 weeks is what we've come down to.
Well, thanks from just a citizen for all the hard work you're doing. Senator Mayne, you're part of that legislative redistricting process as well, and you also represent a very racially and ethnically diverse area. I'm wondering how does that impact your approach to thinking about these new districts?
Well, what it does too is, and thank you for mentioning that, my Senate district is very diverse, religiously, culturally, racially, all those. It's just a great community, and it has mostly unaffiliated voters. So there's a lot of free thinkers out here, and and obviously I enjoy that. But it's really important. Most of my schools are Title I. I have a high school that's Title I, and that's not particularly to poverty levels. It's diversity, it's language, all those things that we embrace in West Valley and the west side of Salt Lake County. So there's grants, there's funding, there's all kinds of avenues for help for my community. That's why, this is so important for us, and for the whole state. They're all in the same, ball of wax. The census gives them all kinds of information for all kinds of avenues for funding, for programs, all those things. That's why it's so important.
Thank you for that insight. Professor Curry, I'm wondering if you've seen anything kind of nationally, this current round of very exciting redistricting that caught your attention.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. One is a little bit of what we're seeing in the state, where like this is an accelerated process everywhere because of the delays with the census, which I think just creates even more uncertainty for a lot of our elected representatives and senators, which I feel funny being the one to say that in this Zoom room. But like this, these are usually nationally, at least, these are usually the electoral cycles that create the most heartburn and uncertainty for incumbent legislators at both the state and the national level, because they don't know how their districts are going to change. They don't know how much they're going to change. They're going to have new voters. They're going to lose some voters that they've known for the last several to 10 years, maybe longer. And the fact that this whole process is happening in such a expedited fashion, and potentially in some places a later fashion, just adds to that uncertainty and that stress, which means next year will be a very dynamic electoral season in a lot of ways. And the other thing that's worth noting is that we've seen sort of as redistricting has become something of more of a political hot button issue in the last few years, with different perceptions on how redistricting should occur in the two major parties. We've also seen a weird dynamic in that you have one party that isn't seem to be as aggressively willing to use redistricting this time around to try to create maps for maximum partisan advantage in some places, and another party that is, which may lead to very differential effects. That wasn't always in the case. This was something that both parties were willing to use very strategically, but the national politics around it we'll see as the maps come out, but the national politics around it may mean something very different this time around.
I just like to add to that. I see what you're saying, but have you ever had a chore at work you had to do? And geez, I can do it Friday night, or I can do it Sunday night. This is what I see. When you have a time crunch, you need to get work done. And I think that we've done that in the committee. We move fast. We've been different communities, but for that, we haven't lost the zeal. We're all together. We go to one meeting, we get information and the draw maps. And so where it's not collective, it hasn't gotten lost in time. So saying what I understand, but I think we've got the work done, for one thing, because we had to. And for the other thing, it was fresh in our minds all the time because we never lost focus of what we were doing, where were we going. So that maybe others have comments on that, but I thought it was really more efficient.
Commissioner Facer, this one's not on the list, but do you want to talk about any of the public feedback? And I'm sorry, Representative Ray and Senator Mayne, I just haven't been as tied into the legislative process, but I know that the Independent Redistricting Commission has gotten quite a bit of feedback from Utahns.
Yeah, and I want to say something with respect to what the professor said. He talked about some divisions in the kinds of strategies that were being used. I think that's one of the things that has made the Utah Independent Redistricting Commission very different from a lot of other places. We've seen some states where their commissions are presenting opposing maps, for example. We have taken a very different strategy. In some ways, I heard people talk about the Utah way, and maybe this is part of that Utah way, where we have put bipartisan map drawing teams together so that the maps are drawn by somebody who was appointed by the Republicans and somebody who was appointed by the Democrats in an effort to try and get us to focus on what really matters and the perspectives of the citizens. And so as we've been traveling around, one of the things that has happened is we would come back after a set of public hearings, and each of our map drawing teams would say, what did we hear last weekend? How can we adjust the maps to accommodate the kinds of things that we were hearing? I think that's been one of the real positives that we've seen out of this process. One of the other things that we've seen is that we're getting different kinds of information than we've ever gotten before. We've had over 1,000 comments, for example, about communities of interest, which is a new criteria that we have to look at that asks us to try and keep communities of interest together. Now, those could be economic communities, they could be cultural communities, they could be religious communities. Now, that's part of the challenge, is that they could be defined in a lot of different ways, but by getting lots of people to give us perspectives, that helps us understand the challenges that we have to try and keep communities together that would like to be together. And when we make divisions in communities, to try and make it in a way that makes sense.
Again, as a citizen, that's exciting to hear. So I'm gonna flip back to you, Professor Curry. And I know we just kind of discussed, we've got some different things happening here with this kind of bipartisan effort, but you've looked at the impacts of partisanship in politics in general, outside of redistricting. And I'm just wondering, how does this process, which we only get to do once a decade, how does that impact the partisanship that we see played out in our politics?
Yeah, so this is one of those things where, like, if you listen to the public dialogue, you hear a lot of discussion about how redistricting or gerrymandering, as it'll be derisively called, has a significant effect on how much partisanship or what party polarization we see. But the political science research that exists largely does not find that redistricting plays a significant role in party polarization. A lot of things have been found to drive polarization, whether it's the realignment of the parties, or two-party competition for control in Washington, or the resorting of voters over time. But gerrymandering and redistricting are not among those major things. And there's also limited evidence that from political science research that suggests that redistricting has been a major cause of any sort of decline in competitive races between the two parties over the years. So it's something that's very, very interesting. And a lot of it just stems from, there's so many other forces at play in our politics, and redistricting is this relatively nuanced process where people can't really take advantage of it to the degree that you hear that they might in the public perception. There's too many other concerns involved in that process, as these folks well know, where it doesn't necessarily have as big of an impact as people often think.
If I can add to that, Mallory, I mean, as you look at the data, you break down Salt Lake County, data is what really drives your redistricting. You have to draw districts, and if you've got half of a county that's completely Democrat, the other half is completely Republican, you're not going to mix the two it just doesn't happen. That data is going to drive where those seats are and how you draw them. So no matter how bad, if you wanted to go in and say, for instance, Salt Lake County has 27 seats in the Utah Legislature within the Salt Lake County borders, there's no way I could go in and draw seats to try to deplete Democrats, just because there's a line. There's a blue section and a red section, and you can't take a little bit from the bottom, a little bit from the top, and try to mix them. And if you look at the 4th district last time when they created that, I mean, there was all kinds of screaming and yelling that was the most gerrymandered district around, but it is the most competitive district in the nation, because it's flipped almost every other election. It's flipped seats. So it's hard to say that was set up one way or the other, and maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, I don't know, but it certainly is the most competitive. So Professor Curry is exactly right. It's hard. There's only so much you can do because of where population lives and the data that's behind that. It really is what drives your redistricting.
I'm going to go to the bottom of my question list, kind of flip this a teeny bit, and this goes out to anybody. And I think it's been teed up really well by both Professor Curry and Representative Ray, but work that Morgan over at the Hinckley Institute did originally, and then I got to update a little bit after, but looked at competitive races in the state, getting down to our more local level. So state house, state senate, not necessarily thinking about the big congressional districts, but the number of competitive races has kind of declined over the years. You might not have anyone file against someone else, or, the race is really skewed. And so I'm curious if there is an interest in kind of having competitive districts, or if, how important is that in the state?
Well, I can respond from the Independent Commission's perspective, and it's not one of the criteria that we look at. We don't look at anything that has to do with politics. We can't favor or disfavor a candidate, an incumbent, a potential candidate, or a political party. And so we really have stayed out of that fray. We don't know where the voters are in terms of party identification. We have access to some demographics, but that's it. And so what we hope is that by drawing maps that make sense and keep communities whole, that we'll have communities that represent themselves in a way that they feel an ownership.
Yeah, exactly. Same here from the committee side. If you go in and you draw maps specifically to make them competitive, that is the definition of gerrymandering. Not letting the data and just the communities of interest and those things, kind of dictate what you're doing. But if you're going in and saying, I have to cut these up to make them competitive, then you are gerrymandering. And it's the same. as I'm looking at my maps, I haven't looked at any political data yet. I'm looking at the notes we took from our meetings and where the data is driving us on these seats and what's happening. And I can tell you, I've got a lot of my own party that's mad at me right now because I'm telling them, hey, the data is not there. You don't get to pick your district. We're letting, we're going by where the numbers are. And, and that's, as Professor Curry said earlier, that's going to cause a lot of angst in the upcoming elections. And it's that way every 10 years.
That's right. I'd like to, and competitive, coming from a Democrat, we're competitive all the time. So we never, nothing's easy in our world. So, so it makes me laugh. But I with my two colleagues, I can speak to that. My senators, they're drawing maps. There are citizens, everyone, is drawing map. They have information, but we have so much available to us. And when the independent commission, we put them together, they'll have an answer. But the same, the good representative says, the data drives it. We cannot, there's no numbers to make up or move around. It is what it is. I have to pick up 14,000 people. And most of my colleagues, I can speak for the Democrats. I don't know so much about the House numbers, but we have areas that have grown, but not grown enough. And then the South, in the southern part of Utah County, they have people coming out here and there and everywhere. So, that's the journey. The numbers are the numbers. And so whatever we do has to follow the data.
I can just add a few points to this because I think it's a really interesting question, Mallory, as you put it, is competition really like all that it's cracked up to be? And like on one hand, yeah, you want electoral competition at some level because, beyond altruistic behavior from our representatives, whether it's at the state or the national level or the local level, competition is the only thing that ensures our elected officials will be attentive to the concerns of their voters, because then they have to face their voters at the end of the day. And if those districts just aren't competitive, if the districts aren't competitive at all in any way, then there's not a whole lot of pressure there. But on the other hand, we also know that too much political competition has a lot of undesirable effects. There's some evidence that too much competition between the parties in elections can lead to a really destructive type of politics, like hyper competitive politics, where the two parties are constantly in conflict as they try to constantly draw contrasts with each other rather than work together towards solutions. And so there's a balance there anyway, beyond the fact that redistricting is a process that's constrained enough that it's hard to do this without, as Representative Ray put it, without drawing some really crazy looking districts, which people don't like. There's also a actual balance there of not wanting to go too far just for competition's sake, because that doesn't necessarily create a politics that people are going to like better than a politics of relatively uncompetitive politics.
All of this made me realize we didn't actually get into the specifics of what the Independent Redistricting Commission, the criteria that they have to consider. Would you mind speaking to that, Commissioner Fraser?
Sure. We have a broad set of criteria that really create some interesting dynamics. And just like the legislative committee, we have to pay attention to equal population. That drives, and that's where that discussion around the numbers comes from, is that there's an expectation that each person is represented equally across the districts. We have contiguity. That's a criteria that the Legislative Redistricting Commission has to pay attention to as well. And then we have compactness, that we don't want to have irregularly drawn districts that can't be explained by other factors. Now, people will look at our lines and go, gosh, I see some really strange lines some places. But part of that's because we're following city boundaries. City boundaries that I'm sure Representative Ray has had this same experience. You look at them and you go, holy cow, how in the world did we come up with those kinds of crazy lines? Well, we did, and we're trying to keep those whole. That's one of our criteria, is to try and keep cities and counties whole where we can. We also are looking at trying to use natural boundaries where it makes sense. Rivers, freeways, mountain ranges, those kinds of things. And then communities of interest is probably one of the most kind of interesting criteria that we now are using. And then we also have the criteria that I mentioned of not favoring or disfavoring or providing any undue advantage to candidates or political parties. So that gives you kind of a quick snapshot of the broad set of criteria that we're using. And the challenge is that when you do one, when you try and keep a city together, that may create some problems in your compactness, or there are even occasions where the contiguity becomes a challenge in trying to keep some communities together. But no matter what, those communities have to be together. We can't be cherry picking across areas to bring a community together.
And Representative Ray or Senator Mayne, the legislative redistricting process is focused more on just the population numbers, or are there other criteria that you all are considering in your process?
Well, we are obviously, we're looking at the population data, but we are also, I mean, if you look at our principles, we're looking at, same thing, contiguity, compact size. We're trying to keep communities whole where we can. And, Rex is exactly on when I've had staff pull up some maps, what the heck are those lines there for? And then you look and it's the city boundaries. They've zigzagged them through some areas. And so it looks awful bad. So those are primarily what we're looking at. One thing that I asked for our staff to do when you go into our website, which is redistricting.utah.gov, you can draw your own maps. You have the ability to put labels for incumbents so that you can have the incumbents where they currently live, at least the census block where they live, it'll identify that. And we did that for the purpose for the community when they draw maps. If they want to have those, they can, because honestly, they're the ones that elected those individuals in those districts. And so we think they ought to at least know where their representatives live. And, the fact is, when we're drawing maps, we know where incumbents live. So we thought it would be good for the public to have that same advantage. And then when they look at our maps, they can lay that incumbent layer over and see what we did. So it just gave a greater transparency to the public to see what we're doing with our maps and where we live as legislators.
Yes, I'd like to add to that. I think that's every committee commission has tools that they've used, and this is a tool that we've used. It's not a secret where I live. I mean, the address is everywhere. All my legislative colleagues, that address is out there. It's not like it's a secret. So when they do their maps, and we've seen some, one of the best ones that I thought, remember down, was it in Richfield? He did a CRIN, and he drew some of the communities in CRIN. So it was so easy for us to see. But we're getting all kinds of people with all kinds of ideas and maps. And I think we've given, with the two entities that are working on that, we've given them two vehicles to draw the kind of maps that they're comfortable with. And I'm comfortable with the information we have and the information that the commission has.
So in the information that you're getting from the community, are you hearing some pretty different things? Because we do have these areas that are experiencing this rapid, intense growth. We have these areas that are experiencing population decline. Like we've got some diversity of experiences just in population throughout the state. And so I'm curious what kind of feedback you've been receiving from these different areas that are going through very different things.
I'll just speak and let the chairs speak. Just was in my mind, if that's okay with the chairs. What I'm getting is they say, well, look at that. Just speaking for West Valley, I live in West Valley. We have like a 600 unit going up and a 700, condos. And they said, well, look at that. How can you need 14,000 people? I said, because we didn't count today. We don't count on the come. And they'll say, well, I just got this in my neighborhood. We're counting months ago on that day when we saw that population. And they say, well, you've got to think about the future. Well, we have to think of that day and that time. And that's what I've gotten more so than anything else. Maybe my colleagues can, if they've got that kind of comment too.
Well, a good example of that was when we were out in Eagle Mountain. They noted that their population is roughly 43,000. They've noted that they've added about 7,000 people in the last year and a half. The dynamic growth has not stopped, but as Senator Mayne knows, we have to use the data that was collected by the Census Bureau. And we can only take so much into account in terms of where potential growth is. We have modest ability to pay attention to our deviations, but you can't account for the kind of growth that we're seeing with those modest deviations. And so what you have to do is try and do the best you can to allow these communities the ability to represent themselves in a way that makes sense to them.
And what I'm hearing too is every community has their own view of what they want. We go to Tooele, and Tooele wants their own state senator. Just for Tooele, well, they have a population of 74,000 people. Okay, a state senate seats almost 113,000. So that's not going to happen. They're going to have to combine with somebody. We go into communities, and some communities will say, we only want one representative representing ours. Other communities will say, hey, we want 2 or 3 because we like having extra voices. So it's really the opinion. And some communities are saying, don't lump us with this county over here. We need to be over here with these counties. And so every community has their own idea of how they ought to be redistricted, which is the reason that Rex and I took our committees out on the road and took this information down. So as we're drawing, we can kind of look at each of those communities specifically to see if we can help them out wherever we can.
And there are times where we can accommodate those kinds of comments. I remember when we were down in southern Utah, in Washington City, Karen Hale and I are a mapping team, and we had a map that we thought was pretty interesting. And the first comment that came out of somebody's mouth was how, what a horrible idea it was, because they didn't want the folks in southern Utah didn't want to be grouped with the folks in Salt Lake County. They said, we might be willing to put up with Utah County, but we're not willing to put up with Salt Lake County. And so you've got these kinds of very divergent opinions all across the state. And our challenge is to try and balance those and make wise choices. And I really have to give a shout out to my fellow commissioners. They have been putting in incredible amounts of time. Commissioner Hilliard, who's a former member of the state Senate, has probably spent 20 or 30 days driving down from Logan and then spending 8 to 10 hours a day mapping. And the other commissioners are doing similar kinds of yeoman effort. And why are they doing it? They're doing it because they want to try and produce maps that are going to help the legislature make the best decision that they can make.
I will throw out that day, the reflective day of the census is April 1. So every 10 years, get excited for April 1. It's a party. We were going to throw a big party. COVID put a stop to that, but mark your calendar for 2030, April 1. Pretty exciting. Professor Curry, I don't know if you watched this at all, but back east and kind of in the Midwest, there's some states that haven't grown. And are their redistricting processes different? Because Utah is a state that has just grown since we were a territory. We just keep growing and growing. Are there different approaches in different places when you have different population stories?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge that comes with relative population loss, usually the states haven't actually lost population, but have just grown slower and have lost seats at the federal level, at the national level, is that now you have, say, 19 incumbent members of Congress, and you only get to have 18 seats, or sometimes 17 seats if you lose 2. And then what? And the challenge becomes, it's a challenge that luckily we haven't had to face in this state, is which 2 incumbents do you put together? And they have to go up against each other to try to keep their seat, because somebody's going to lose the seat. And that's a challenge that we don't have to face here. Luckily, I don't think that's a fun decision for anyone to have to make about whose political future is now in greater jeopardy. But that's something you're seeing in the Midwest or in the Northeast or in other parts of the country where the population growth hasn't been what it is out here in the Southwest. And then that adds another layer of intensity to this process, and that the legislators are all very concerned about whether they're still going to have their district come 2022.
Well, if I can note that when it comes to trying to keep districts, it becomes really difficult to keep the boundaries exactly the same. It's impossible to keep the boundaries the same. But one of the things that makes it so difficult is it also depends on where you start drawing your districts. We have found through painful experience that starting in the population center and working out to the edges makes it really, really difficult, because we've got places like Daggett County and Rich County that have under a couple of thousand people. And if you get to there and you all of a sudden need 4,000 people and you've only got 1,000, then you're out of luck. And so we found it much more convenient to start on the outside and work in. But even then, as soon as maybe you've got an area in northern Utah that didn't grow as fast, and so they've got to gain some more population, like Senator Mayne's district she was talking about. Well, when you take that additional population out of another district, that then balloons out into another district, and that then balloons out into another district. And so before long, you've got districts that don't resemble anything to what they did before, because you've got some areas that are essentially going to lose a seat, and other areas such as southwestern Salt Lake County and northwestern Utah County are essentially gaining some seats. And so that really creates a dynamic that is Representative Ray said is driven by the numbers fundamentally.
We had, Mallory, we had in one of our town hall meetings down in Cedar City, we had one of our legislative members come in and he wasn't on the committee. So he just kind of came in and said, hey, look, my district's relatively the same as it was population wise, so I'm not going to really be involved. I don't really need to do anything. And then when we explained what his district was going to look like, which meant he was probably going to get put in somebody else's district, he became adamantly involved after he got through the deer in the headlights of what we've been calling the ripple effect. Nobody is safe. In caucus last month during interim day, the speaker, we were all in there as a Republican caucus, and the speaker said, anybody who was here last time, raise your hand. So, a few of the members raised their hands, and then he said, how many of you got exactly what you wanted last time? And obviously there were no hands after that. And his point was, this is going to hurt everybody. Nobody's boundaries are going to stay the same. And as I'm looking through, just like Rex said, pretty much every single boundary is going to change. I don't see any districts at all that are going to stay exactly the same based on when you think about the heat index of population in South Salt Lake County and in Washington County, those are the two hot buttons. And just by changing those two, really that circulates the entire state. Even my district up in Davis County, it looks a lot different than what I have today. And I like what I have today. I'm not so happy about what I'm going to have come January 1st, but that's where the numbers are. There's no, refuting what's out there.
Kind of speaking to what you were saying, nationally, and we saw in Utah, but the areas kind of adjacent to the existing urban core that are a little bit more suburban were the areas that experienced the most rapid growth everywhere. So this obviously plays into everything you all have to consider in your processes. Yeah, Professor Chris.
Yeah, I just want to say, I hope some of my students are watching this, because every semester or every year, I try to convince them that redistricting is such a difficult, nuanced process. And it's not just this political grab bag power move that's so easy to do by one party or the other. And so this is great. And so I just want to point that out, because I hope some of my students are listening carefully, because it is such a difficult, time consuming, nuanced process that is just not that easy to get some sort of strategic outcome out of, even though that's what people tend to think.
I would encourage your students or anyone else that's interested to go and play around with the maps and try to draw your own districts. I did that with a colleague when I was at a previous job, and we spent way too much time being like, we can fix this. And then it's so difficult. And that was using the 2010 data. So we have a couple questions from the viewers that I want to add in before we get to the end. And this is kind of basic, but we should address it. What's the main goal of redistricting? And then just reminding everyone when this process will be done, and maybe kind of the local redistricting as a follow-on, that'll happen after the state process.
Mallory, the interesting thing is we do a little presentation for each one of our meetings. We talk about redistricting and reapportionment, because they're two separate. So when we do the census and then we get the data, what happens is first Congress reapportions. They go through and they get congressional seats and they assign those out based on population. Once they do that, the data is sent to us and we actually redistrict. And the whole purpose behind that is every 10 years, there's been a huge population shift typically. And we're trying to get back to one person, one vote. So you want every district to have the same number of people, so those areas have the same voice on the Hill. You don't have Like, for instance, we've had people coming in saying, you need to have one senator for every county instead of redistricting like we do. So basically, you'd have Salt Lake with a population of 1 million people, and Daggett County with 935 people. So those 935 would have the same weight as over 1 million people, which is not fair. And so the whole idea is to keep those numbers spread out so that every 10 years, we're pushing populations back into equal districts so that everybody has the same voice when it comes to the Hill. So that's the whole purpose behind redistricting.
What are the population thresholds for a state house and a state senate seat?
So a house population is 43,622, and the state senate is 118, I think 118,902. So just a little, 112,902. So a little below 113,000 is what we're looking at between the two.
As a fun population point of reference, I think we only have 3, maybe 4 cities over 100,000. So just for people to think about, just even cities, we are not a place full of giant cities. We're still kind of middle-sized cities. Commissioner Facer, this one is kind of big, but we'll see what you can do. How do you define independent for the Independent Redistricting Commission? And then what mechanisms are in place to ensure that the commission is independent? You're muted.
Independent from the perspective of the Independent Commission is twofold. One, it's that we're operating separate from and not under the direction of the legislature and the legislature's redistricting committee. And so in that sense, we're independent. We have our own budget, we have our own staff. Now the other way in which we're independent is we were appointed by leadership from the Republicans in the legislature and the Democrats in the legislature. And what makes those appointments so interesting is that 2 of the appointments can be partisan appointments, but one of them has to be an independent appointment. And so it has to be somebody who has not been involved in partisan politics, either as a registered voter or in any other sort of way. And so you really have this kind of fascinating dynamic where we've got 2 Republicans, 2 independents, and 2 Democrats that were appointed by the legislature. And they then have a voice that really is able to speak freely. And because we've operated in such a kind of cooperative bipartisan way, it really has allowed us to feel like we are standing independently of either any kind of party influence or any kind of direct manipulation by the legislature.
And let me add, in the statute, I can't call Rex and talk maps or lines with him. We've drawn that line so that it can't feel like I'm pressuring him or that we're trying to, get them to do a map that we like. We've drawn that line so that the commission can be independent from us. And I think this has been a great process. Rex has been great to work with. And I'm excited to see the maps that they bring to us because they've done a lot of public meetings and they put many, many hours. I've watched some of your map drawing and I am really excited to see what you bring to us.
And we're really hopeful that they will like our maps. Yeah, just because as Representative Ray notes, we've tried to be very transparent in this process. So the map drawing sessions where we have our map drawing teams, we broadcast those on YouTube. So anybody that wants to watch them and see the kinds of decision-making processes that we go through is we're trying to agonize, well, do we divide something at 4th West or do we divide it at 6th West? Those are all open and transparent for people to observe.
And another thing too, the trust that goes in, I'm minority leader and I had input on appointees to the commission. So that shows the cooperation, that we had and the trust that we have in the commission. And, there's principles that we follow. We talked about those, compactness, to make sure the communities of interest stay together. I mean, there's formulas that we use that we have to use as you also too, in making so what we're all looking at is what we're all looking at. It's a little bit scenario. We use a little different techniques and whatever, but still we have those community interest. We have all those formulas. I'm looking at them right now and we'll speak to them. We all know them and that's the goal.
We have one other kind of definition question, and then we'll kind of wrap everything up. But I guess this is mostly for you, Commissioner Facer, but how do you define communities of interest?
So again, as I mentioned, communities of interest are an interesting animal. They're relatively new in the redistricting process. They were used by a few states in 2010, but there are more states trying to use them. And the way we've defined it is we've given some guidance to the public that it's a contiguous area, that it could be a neighborhood, it could be a community of ethnic or cultural interest, it could be an economic interest. So if people from say Richfield all go to Gunnison to go shopping, or whatever, if they define that as their community, we let them define that. And so what we've done is we've gone around the state, and people can do it on our website. We have a map drawing tool that allows people to draw simple shapes around their neighborhood or around their ethnic community. And we then have layered those on top of each other, and you can see those on our website, uirc.utah.gov. And so we then get essentially heat maps that shows us the concentration of where those areas are. Now, in some cities, like Provo, for example, they've got something like 30 plus neighborhoods, and they actually have drawn those neighborhoods out. And so we could use those, but most of our communities don't have well-defined neighborhoods that way that they've actually drawn borders to. And so getting that input from the public and allowing them to tell us where those communities are has been very helpful to us.
What, Commissioner Facer, what is in the packet that you're going to provide to the legislature? And then Representative Ray and Senator Mayne, does the legislature have to accept these maps, or can the legislature have the, take a different take?
So I'll talk a little bit about what we're putting together. I will note that we've still got 2 weeks before we deliver it. So there's some of that that's still being shaped, but there'll be a report that describes our process and describes some of the kind of guiding philosophies to some of the different approaches. Because one of the things that when you look at some of the other states, for example, Michigan, we had a presentation on Michigan's maps the other day, and their 3 maps that they've presented, I guess there were 4, but they were all very similar. And what you see from our maps is we're actually providing some different perspectives. So you aren't getting cookie cutter copies of the maps that have just one little variation here. You get maps that have some different philosophies about what sets them apart. And so we'll talk about that. It'll then include the maps. And it will then also include information from all the comments that we've gotten from the communities of interest, comments from the general public, and all of those kinds of things. So there will be a very robust set of appendices that have all of that kind of data, because as we've told the people, we want to make sure their voice is carried and presented to the legislature.
The Mallory, I think as far as we're not required under statute to accept their maps, they give them to us, but I would really, really like to use some of their maps. And it might come down to, we take a majority of their map and sit down and say, okay, we need to make a little change here and there or something, but we are really going in open-minded. And, I can tell you politically and media wise, it would benefit us a lot if we could use one of their maps. So we're not adverse to it at all. And like I say, we would really like to. I'd like to use maps from them. I'd like to use maps from the public, just to show that we listen and that we're, really want the feedback and accept the feedback that's given to us.
I just like to add something that I don't think we've touched on is the school boards. Every meeting we've gone to, that is so important. And that surprised me. I thought there'd be more so homegrown, but I didn't realize how homegrown the school districts are. People have spoken like at Ogden and the issue that they had up there with school districts. Rose Park, we had, and they spoke of the history of what they've gone through with school districts not being appropriate to the community. And we heard that all over. And the superintendent spoke about sharing transportation and all these things. That was really enlightening. And I was really happy to see that, because I was enlightened. I live in West Valley. There's a ton of people here. I have one school district that I deal with. So when the population spoke about, having to deal with mixed districts and how that was really good for us to know. And I think we're very watchful of that. And I can't speak for my chair, but I think that was enlightening for me.
Yeah, the school boards are interesting because right now, what they're called LEAs, local education associations, they're divided in, as we go through the school board seats, there's 31 times that school boards are broken into different school board seats, or that school districts. And so our goal is to try to drive that down as close as possible. And I know I've seen a map that had it down to 6, which I think is about, because for instance, you have Davis County, who has 450,000 people in Davis County. And you have a school board seat that's about 200 and something thousand, I think 208,000 people in a school board seat. So you're not going to be able to not divide Davis County, but you don't have to divide it 3 times. You can divide it 1 time. And so we're looking at maps. Jennifer Kravitz was the former school board member in Ogden that spoke to the committee and talked about, not dividing LEAs where possible. I think Weaver District right now is divided into 3 separate ones. And they do a lot of things together. So we're trying to go down and divide them as few times as possible. And I think UEA presented a map our last meeting in Clearfield, and I think they had it down. Senator Mayne, I think they had it down to 7 or 8 times that it was split. And then I think 3 of them was split more than once, which again, you're probably going to have to do at some point. So we are looking at that very closely to make sure that we try to keep those school districts together as much as possible.
And I will add that even though that's not one of the formal criteria that we have, we are paying attention to that, because we agree that just like cities and counties, we ought to be trying to keep them as whole as possible. But there are some unique situations, as they talk about some of the transportation agreements across school districts. So there are times where we want to try and, if we're going to put school districts together, we want to make sure we put the right ones together as well. And so it really is much more interesting. And we're getting additional feedback from the school boards. I know I'm meeting with some school board officials in the next couple of days to see how they react to the variations that we have, to see if there's one that they like better than the others, that we can kind of advance more forcefully.
Well, thanks for all of these amazing insights. I learned a lot this time, and I've sat in on several of these, so this was really interesting. I'm going to do one last wrap up. I'm going to start with Professor Curry, but then a question for the rest of you to be thinking about: how can everyone get involved in this home stretch, or at the beginning of November? So Professor Curry, if you could provide any insights or advice or something from things you've seen in this redistricting process, and kind of as they finish up this once a decade process, what would it be?
What would it be to look for, or what would it be just the takeaways? Okay.
Whatever.
Any takeaways? I think an important takeaway here is I think our state actually has a really unique and interesting and well-structured process, and that we have now with this new process, and that we have an independent commission that can draw maps that are on the record, but we still leave it up to our elected representatives to make the final call. And I think that's really important, because in other states, they just will have a commission, or they'll just have a legislature. And there's pros and cons there. If you just have a commission, then there's no electoral accountability for the people who make the decision about what your districts look like. And that's not ideal. And if you just have a legislature, then you only have one group of people proposing maps that are put on the actual public record. This is a really nice balance and a really nice mix. And I know it wasn't a mix that necessarily made everyone happy when it first went into place, but I really, really like this, and that you have a little bit of both, and then you have electoral accountability at the end of the day for the maps that get put into place. And I hope that Utahns can focus on something that I think that we will be doing really well this time around, and hopefully into the future.
Sure, I can start on ways that people can be involved. So I want to talk about two different ways. One, we're still up through the 23rd accepting public comment. And if people haven't submitted their maps, they can submit those to us. And we will review those up until the 23rd. And then after the 23rd, we will adopt our final maps and have the final tweaks. And what we want is we want people to pay attention to those, look at them, tell the legislature what they like about them, what they don't like about them, but be involved as a voice to share their perspective on how they've been able to be involved and how they've seen the process work. So that we can then get maps that, again, the people have a sense of understanding and ownership over.
And for us, we still have a few meetings left. We've got tomorrow night, the 19th at 6 p.m. And then the first at 2 p.m. is when the commission comes to present their maps. And I think that's a great time to have the public there when they're actually presenting their maps. And you can have input to us based on the maps that you're seeing. And then November 8th, we'll have a meeting. I'm not sure the time, probably 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. And all of these are at the Capitol building, another opportunity to do that. And I think what's really important for people to understand is this is not DC politics that's going on here. Our sides get along really well together between the Republicans and the Democrats. I've spent as much time with the Democrats working on their maps as I have with my own party working on the maps. And if you look at the data, the Democrats, just under the data in Salt Lake County, potentially should lose 2 seats just based on movement. And I'm trying not to let that happen. We're trying to help them retain a couple of seats if we can and not do that. And so it's been, I think very collaborative, at least on the House side, as we've sat down between the parties and worked and try to take everybody's needs into account, as we've gone as far as their districts and the communities of interest they have, and trying to keep, people together within their districts, is a thing that we've been working on. And it's not broken out into red and blue. It's really broken out into what's best for this community. How can we answer the needs that we've heard as we've gone out on some of these? You go up to Vernal, for instance, and Daggett County came in and said, look, right now we're over with Rich County and Morgan County and Summit County, but we fit better with Uinta County. And so we're looking at trying to cut Daggett down into Uinta County versus across into Rich and Summit County. So we are taking that in. And really for us, we want good solid lines on maps, things that people can look at and say, yeah, that looks really good, except for the jagged edges of the cities that we have no control over. But when you see a jagged edge, zoom in and look at it. You'll probably also see a city boundary there.
Yes, and I'd like to speak to that too. And I have to speak for the House. I work with the good representative in all our meetings. But for the Senate, is that my senators have drawn maps just like all the other senators. And I, being a D, I'm a little watchful because there's, I have 6 sitting senators, so we love them all. And but we have all the opportunity. We're drawing maps. We're in the conversation. And like I've told my senators, we need structure. Show me some structure for each one of your districts. And as we've said from the beginning, the data will prove wherever we need to move. But we've been transparent. The meetings are open. And I spoke a few minutes ago about the map in Kren, how that's what the chair is speaking about. When he showed us, and it was a map in Kren, and that's the one. It didn't have to be fancy, but that's the one that resonated to, and that was from a citizen. So everything is in. We want to do the best we can, and everyone has had a piece in there. But it's about as transparent as you can have it. And we have been given the same opportunity as my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. As the citizens that come to our committee, we've been treated the same. Everybody has a conversation and a piece of the pie.
Well, I'd like to thank the Hinckley Institute for hosting this panel. I'd like to thank the panelists for all of their insights and their candor in talking about this. And I do hope that people that tuned in or people that watch this soon before the 1st, you go and visit the websites of the Independent Redistricting Commission as well as the legislative redistricting process. Look at those assets that are out there and available to you, and hope you feel like you can express your voice in this effort, because we only get to do it once a decade. So thank you all for your time, and I think with that we'll